spring of 1943 brought no relief to either side on the Eastern Front. The earth, cracked by frost and explosions, had become a landscape of ruin, where life and death existed side by side. Among the trenches and shattered villages, several kilometers from the front line, stood a field hospital. It had no clear boundaries, a collection of tents, makeshift huts, and improvised operating areas under canvas sheets. The chief surgeon there was Captain Alexei Gorin, a military doctor with pre-war experience in a civilian trauma clinic. From the day of his arrival, his work was a battle against time. The flow of wounded never stopped, day or night. Instruments wore out faster than they could be replaced. Electricity was scarce. The lamps ran on weak batteries. A rubber hose could serve as a tourniquet, and a door taken off its hinges became an operating table. Despite these limitations, order was maintained through discipline and skill. Every day brought the same cycle: convoys of stretchers, the noise of generators, the smell of antiseptic. In the midst of chaos, Gorin maintained the precision of habit. He was known as a doctor who could work 2 days without sleep, who never hesitated or wasted motion. He cared about only one thing: whether a life could still be saved. At the end of March, a group of badly wounded soldiers arrived after a heavy artillery bombardment. Many had injuries beyond repair, the kind for which standard treatment was useless. Amputations had become routine, but there were no resources for prosthetics in a field hospital. Doctors could only stop the bleeding, clean the wound, and send the man to the rear, where survival depended on chance. That night, Gorin began to think differently. He understood that evacuation for many was impossible. The roads were destroyed, communication with the rear unreliable, transport constantly at risk. The wounded remained in the tents, waiting for whatever came next. And so an idea formed in his mind, one he first dismissed as madness: to try to create a functioning artificial limb right there on the battlefield, using only the materials at hand. He had no ambition to invent. His goal was to reduce suffering, to give one man at least a chance at movement. Around him lay fragments of aluminum plating from damaged vehicles, scraps of leather straps, torn bandages, and wire debris of war that could, in theory, be transformed into something new. Before the war, Gorin had worked in university hospitals and studied trauma mechanics. He was fascinated by the movement of the human body joints, ligaments, balance. Those lessons now returned to him. On the backs of medical forms, he began sketching lines, calculating lengths and angles, not as a surgeon but as an engineer. He worked at night, by the dim flame of a kerosene lamp. He scavenged metal strips from stretchers, copper wire from field telephones, bits of tubing from broken equipment. Slowly, the outline of a mechanism took shape, crude but promising. It could be attached with straps, had a movable joint at the knee, and even a simple imitation of a foot. It was not elegant, but it might work. No one in the hospital knew what he was doing after hours. To most, it looked like the same relentless dedication that defined his service. Only the senior nurse, noticing bits of metal and sketches, suspected he was working on something unusual, but even she did not ask questions. War did not allow curiosity. It demanded endurance. Spring replaced winter, but the front line barely moved. The hospital was often under shell fire, forcing surgeons to operate in trenches or abandoned barns. In such conditions, experimentation seemed futile, almost delusional. Yet Gorin persisted. His idea had ceased to be a thought, it had become a task. By May, the first prototype took form: an aluminum frame, a hinged joint made from a steel rod, leather straps for attachment to the thigh. It was far from any medical standard, but in war, there were no standards left. He tested the strength of each part, measuring balance and resistance, observing how metal could mimic the structure of flesh. The device lay on the table, wrapped in bandages and wire, when the next bombardment began. The ground shook, Instruments fell from shelves. Yet Goran did not move. He watched the crude structure in front of him and understood that it represented something greater than improvisation. It was the embodiment of survival, a bridge between life and loss. He could not yet know that within days, this improvised limb would change not only one man's fate, but also how the impossible could be imagined in the midst of war. By early summer, the field hospital had become a permanent fixture among the ruins. Shells exploded in the distance, but life inside followed its own rhythm of exhaustion and endurance. Supplies were dwindling, and surgeries never ceased. Captain Alexei Goran worked silently, his uniform stained from endless operations. At night, when the chaos subsided, he returned to his strange project, the artificial limb built from the wreckage of war. The prototype was rough but functional. Aluminum plates formed the frame, a steel rod acted as a hinge, and leather straps secured the mechanism to the leg. It could bend slightly, maintain balance, and bear limited weight. It was not elegant, but it was the first attempt at restoring motion where life had taken it away. Goran studied its angles as though decoding a language written in metal. Every piece came from something once destroyed. Fragments of stretchers, wires from broken radios, leather from damaged belts, remnants of machines turned into the outline of a human limb. The irony did not escape him. War had taken flesh and returned metal. Yet for him, each adaptation was a small rebellion against the hopelessness surrounding him. When he finally decided to test the prosthesis, he chose a soldier who had lost his leg just above the knee and was unable to be moved to the rear. The patient's condition was stable, but his future uncertain. In silence, the doctor adjusted straps and checked the alignment. The field nurses watched, pretending indifference. No one expected success. The first attempt was brief. The man managed to balance for a few seconds before collapsing back onto the cot. But even that moment felt extraordinary. It was movement awkward, fragile, but undeniably human. Goran noted the tension points, adjusted the joint, and reinforced the strap with extra wire. He worked with the precision of a mechanic repairing a machine that still had a pulse. Word of the experiment spread quietly through the camp. Soldiers whispered about the doctor who was building legs from scrap. Some laughed. Others called it a waste of time. But one evening, an officer from a nearby unit came to see it himself. When he observed the soldier taking 2 unsteady steps with the device, his disbelief was genuine. The officer said nothing, only nodded and left. The rumor began to grow. Goran did not seek recognition. He simply refined his creation, replacing parts, measuring stability. The artificial limb became lighter, more balanced. He added a pivoting ankle joint made from a bolt scavenged from a wrecked vehicle, improving movement by a fraction. Each small change mattered. It was not invention for glory, but necessity turned into ingenuity. In the days that followed, other wounded asked if such a device could help them, but materials were scarce. The doctor continued experimenting with substitutes, wooden braces, strips of canvas, fragments of aluminum cookware. Each attempt taught him more about balance, about how metal could imitate muscle and memory. As the front advanced again, the hospital prepared to relocate. The sky rumbled with approaching artillery, and time was running out. Goran packed surgical tools and sealed medical supplies, but he refused to abandon the prototype. He secured it in a crate alongside field instruments, as if it were another piece of essential equipment. During the retreat, the convoy came under fire. Smoke and dust swallowed the road. The crate holding the artificial limb was damaged, and the mechanism exposed. When German troops later inspected the abandoned site, they found the object and could not believe what they saw. Reports described a makeshift prosthesis of unusual sophistication, apparently built in the field with no proper materials. Military intelligence dismissed it as impossible, the work of chance, not medicine. But for Goran, far from those reports, it was proof that even within destruction, human thought could rebuild. He repaired the device once more in the new hospital camp, continuing his quiet work. The idea had taken form beyond his control. It no longer belonged only to him, but to the wounded, who waited for movement, for hope. War would go on, indifferent to invention or mercy. Yet somewhere amid mud, smoke, and broken machines, a doctor had proven that humanity could still invent, not to destroy, but to restore. By autumn 1943, the front had shifted again, leaving the old field hospital deep in the rear. The new camp was larger, better supplied, but the rhythm of work remained the same: operations, bandages, exhaustion. Captain Alexei Gorin had become known among the medical corps for his unusual prosthesis. Rumors reached command units, though few believed them. In wartime, stories of miracles were dismissed as exaggeration. Still, curiosity reached higher ranks. One afternoon, a medical commission arrived, German prisoners among them, serving as orderlies under supervision. Among the visitors was a foreign surgeon requisitioned to assist the Wehrmacht, who had heard of the invention. His presence was silent and formal, the observation cautious. What they saw in that dim tent defied their expectations. On a wooden table lay the latest version of Gorin's device. It was no longer just metal and straps, but a refined structure, light yet stable. The hinge moved smoothly, the balance precise. When a recovering soldier fitted it and managed to stand, the motion was steady. The doctors watched without speaking. Even the German surgeon leaned forward, studying the mechanism with disbelief. The improvisation contradicted every rule of their craft. After the demonstration, the visitors recorded measurements, sketches, and notes. They asked to inspect the materials, but there was nothing beyond scrap metal and leather. The idea that such functionality could emerge from fragments of war seemed impossible. For them, prosthetics belonged to laboratories and factories, not to muddy tents. Yet the evidence was there, undeniable. The event changed Gorin's position in the medical unit. Officially, the invention was catalogued as experimental rehabilitation aid. He received permission to replicate a few more models. With help from mechanics attached to the corps, he refined production, cutting parts from wrecked vehicles, salvaging copper joints, and crafting alignment rods from ammunition cases. Each model improved slightly, reducing weight and increasing motion range. But success brought scrutiny. Reports reached higher headquarters, and soon inspectors arrived again, this time from the engineering division. They wanted documentation, blueprints, and specifications. Gorin had none, only sketches on the backs of medical records and adjustments made by instinct. His work had grown from need, not procedure. Explaining it in technical terms proved almost impossible. At night, he continued working in secret. The more the army sought to classify his invention, the more personal it became. He saw in it not a project, but a living extension of those he treated. Each piece carried a fragment of their survival. It was not meant for mass production. It was meant for people who had refused to be defined by loss. By late October, the Germans launched another offensive, and the hospital once again came under threat. The front drew closer, the air filled with the sound of distant artillery. Evacuation began in haste. Gorin dismantled the equipment, securing what he could. The prototypes were packed in wooden crates, marked Medical Equipment Priority. During the retreat, part of the convoy was intercepted. When enemy troops examined the abandoned supplies, they found the prosthetic limbs and mistook them for experimental weapons or mechanical traps. Field reports later described them as devices of unknown function. The irony was bitter. Machines built to restore movement were perceived as tools of war. In a subsequent prisoner exchange, fragments of Gorin's work reached German medical staff. They analyzed the construction and could not believe it had been built under combat conditions. One report allegedly described it as an implausible yet effective field adaptation, suggesting that such craftsmanship indicated a level of ingenuity uncommon even in peacetime. Meanwhile, Goran and his remaining team continued working from a new base deeper inland. He received notice that higher command intended to document and replicate his designs formally after the campaign. But he paid little attention. His focus remained on the wounded men arriving each night, on the small victories of movement regained. The invention had already served its purpose, not as a breakthrough of science, but as evidence that humanity could persist where logic ended. What the enemy viewed as impossible, Goran considered inevitable: the need to create, even when surrounded by destruction. In the silence between bombardments, he kept refining the design, unaware that his field-born idea was already being studied by both sides. His creation had transcended ownership. It had become part of the war's strange record, proof that innovation could emerge from desperation, and that even on the battlefield, invention could serve life. Winter 1944 settled over the exhausted front like a frozen veil. The war was shifting, but for the men of the field, hospitals, little changed. Snow covered the ruins, muffling the sound of artillery in the distance. Inside the medical tents, the rhythm of work continued: the same cold instruments, the same dim lights, the same quiet persistence. Captain Alexei Goran had grown older in those years, not by time but by repetition. His invention had traveled further than he imagined, though he barely spoke of it anymore. The improvised prostheses, born from scrap and necessity, now appeared in several military hospitals. Mechanics and surgeons adapted his design, refining its form. The devices were crude compared to true prosthetics, but they gave mobility to hundreds of wounded soldiers who otherwise would have been left immobile. Reports noted the efficiency, the simplicity, and the human ingenuity behind the Goran mechanism. Yet the man himself remained indifferent to recognition. For him, invention was not an achievement, it was a response to suffering. When peace finally began to return, the front lines dissolved into landscapes of silence and snow. Goran's hospital was among the last to be decommissioned. The surviving staff packed instruments, burned medical waste, and left behind the tents that had witnessed so many lives pass through. Goran gathered his notebooks, the same scraps filled with sketches, formulas, and stains, and locked them in a small wooden box. He took nothing else. After the war, the doctor worked in a rehabilitation clinic established in one of the liberated cities. There, he treated men who returned from the front missing pieces of themselves. The conditions were cleaner, the supplies stable, but the faces were the same: determined, weary, and silent. The prosthetic limbs inspired by his field model had evolved, now produced in proper factories. They were stronger, lighter, more symmetrical. Yet when Goran examined them, he recognized his old design hidden beneath the polished metal. He never patented his idea or claimed ownership. His name appeared only in a few internal reports that rarely reached public records. Some historians later mentioned a field-borne prosthetic innovation that surprised even German engineers who studied captured examples. For the opposing side, the notion that such craftsmanship could emerge from a battlefield doctor seemed implausible, an exception, not a rule. But for Goran, it had simply been survival turned into science. In the post-war years, he lived quietly. Occasionally, former soldiers visited him, some walking on factory-made limbs that resembled his early work. They saluted him, offered thanks, and left. He never corrected their stories. It was enough to see motion restored where stillness had once been inevitable. When journalists began documenting wartime inventions, they often overlooked the prosthesis. It lacked spectacle. It was too human, too modest. Tanks and airplanes told louder stories. Yet among the silent statistics of recovery, Goran's work had left a hidden mark, not in steel, but in the concept that even under fire, a doctor could build rather than destroy. Years later, long after his retirement, one of his students found the wooden box in his attic. Inside were the faded sketches and notes written in shorthand. Some pages described pressure points and angles of rotation. Others were simple reflections, fragments of thought recorded between surgeries. One line stood out, written in the margin of a torn medical form. "The hand that cuts must also learn to create." That phrase summarized the legacy better than any medal or citation. It defined the paradox of his time, the coexistence of invention and ruin, progress born from despair. The student donated the notes to a small medical museum where they remain quietly displayed without much explanation. Visitors rarely notice them, but occasionally someone pauses, recognizing the strange simplicity of the designs. Gorin never saw that exhibition. He passed away a few years after the war, leaving behind no memoirs. His colleagues remembered him as methodical, distant, and tireless. A man who could operate through shell fire without hesitation. Few knew that, between surgeries, he had built something that defied both logic and expectation. In later decades, prosthetic technology advanced rapidly, erasing the rough origins of the field model. Yet in every modern joint, in every artificial limb that restores motion, echoes of his invention remain. History rarely credits those who worked in the shadows, but their influence persists, quiet, functional, uncelebrated. The Germans who once examined his crude creation could not believe it was possible. They called it an accident of desperation, not design. But time proved otherwise. What began as a single doctor's attempt to restore movement amid chaos became a symbol of endurance itself, proof that even in war, humanity's instinct to rebuild can survive the darkest conditions,